Welcome back to ABA Chapter Chat. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into some really fundamental ABA tools.
Yeah.
Shaping, chaining, and goal setting.
Yeah. Those are really important.
Yeah, they are.
I mean, they're kind of at the core of a lot of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And these concepts are so vital, I think, for driving behavior change, especially when we're dealing with those complex behaviors that can't be addressed through just like simple reinforcement.
Right. Yeah, it's got to be more nuanced than just giving a kid an M&M.
Exactly. So these techniques offer a framework for sort of breaking down those really intricate behaviors into smaller, more manageable steps.
Yeah, like bite-sized pieces.
Bite-sized pieces, exactly.
Yeah. So instead of feeling overwhelmed by like the complexity of a behavior, we can approach it strategically, almost like like a sculptor gradually shaping a piece of clay.
I love that analogy. That's a great visual.
Yeah.
So let's start with shaping.
Okay.
It's that process of reinforcing those baby steps, those successive approximations, as someone gets closer and closer to that desired behavior. So it's not about expecting like perfection right away.
Right.
But instead, we acknowledge and reinforce those small improvements along the way.
Exactly. And that's why shaping is such a crucial skill, I think, for anyone working in ABA, but honestly, anyone in like a guiding role, so like teachers, parents, even coaches.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing and rewarding those small wins that ultimately lead to mastery.
Absolutely. And the source material gives a great example of this with a restaurant manager training a new waiter named Glenn.
Okay.
And so instead of like bombarding Glenn with criticism right away, the manager highlights what he's doing well and strategically times his feedback for maximum impact.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's a perfect illustration of shaping in action.
It is.
Timing is everything.
It is.
Like, if the manager had waited until the end of Glenn's shift to praise his interactions with the customers, it wouldn't be as effective.
Right.
By providing that immediate feedback, he reinforces those specific behaviors right when they happen.
Right then and there.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not just about positive reinforcement, but it's about the strategic timing of that reinforcement.
Right.
And this example really highlights, I think, the no-but rule.
Oh, yeah.
So you're focusing on the positives before addressing any areas for improvement.
So instead of saying, Glenn, you greeted the customers well, but Tisha, you forgot to offer them drinks, the manager just simply acknowledges and reinforces that successful greeting.
Exactly. And that approach, I think, creates a much more positive learning environment and makes the feedback feel less like criticism and more like guidance.
Absolutely.
And it ties back beautifully to those core principles of shaping, recognizing those small improvements, and understanding the power of timely antecedents. And we even see this in how we shape verbal behavior in ABA therapy.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
All the time.
Like if a child we're working with is trying to request a toy but can only make a sound,
oh, yeah,
we still reinforce that sound to encourage further development.
Yes, exactly. It's all about shaping those initial, sometimes clumsy attempts into clear and functional communication. And patience is crucial here.
Oh, it's so important.
It takes time and observation to identify those small steps towards the goal and reinforce them consistently.
Right, and it makes me think about how shaping is used in teaching sports. One of the sources uses the example of golf.
Okay.
So instead of expecting someone to hit a perfect drive right away,
Right.
you start with those short putts, then gradually increase the distance and complexity.
That's a fantastic example. Simek and O'Brien's approach to teaching golf is all about breaking down that seemingly overwhelming skill into smaller, achievable steps.
And it's like building a house.
Yeah.
You start with a solid foundation and work your way up.
Right.
So how can ABA practitioners use this approach to help clients build those complex skill repertoires? So let's say we're teaching a child how to tie their shoes.
Okay, so instead of expecting them to master all the steps at once,
Right.
we could break it down into smaller chunks. So maybe we start with just having them cross the laces and then making a loop and so on, and we reinforce each step as they master it, gradually building up to that complete skill.
And the beauty of this is it gives the child so many more opportunities for success and reinforcement, which keeps them motivated and engaged.
Exactly.
And it reinforces the idea that learning is a gradual process, and that's okay.
Exactly. It's about progress, not perfection.
Absolutely.
And speaking of progress, it reminds me of the concept of Kaizen.
Kaizen.
Yeah, which Amai describes as this idea of ongoing improvement involving everyone.
Okay, so it's not just about individual progress, but about a culture of continuous improvement.
Yes.
Whether it's in a workplace,
Right.
a school, even within our own ABA practice.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Kaizen aligns beautifully with those principles of shaping,
It does.
emphasizing those small, consistent efforts rather than those drastic overnight changes.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful mindset to embrace, both for ourselves as professionals and for the clients that we work with.
Yes,
It's not about being perfect. It's about constantly striving to be a little bit better each day.
absolutely. And that ties in nicely with our next concept, chaining,
Chaining.
which helps individuals learn complex tasks by linking together a sequence of behaviors.
So while shaping focuses on refining a single behavior, chaining is about connecting multiple behaviors into a smooth flow.
Precisely, imagine teaching a client how to make a sandwich.
Okay.
Each step, getting the bread, spreading the peanut butter, adding the jelly, they all form a link in a behavioral chain.
Okay.
And the reinforcement comes at the end once they've completed the entire sequence and can enjoy that delicious sandwich.
Right. And speaking of chains, the source material uses an example of assembling a motor,
Okay.
where each step from placing the parts to tightening those bolts forms a crucial link in the chain.
Right.
And reinforcement comes at the end when the motor is fully assembled and functional.
It's a perfect illustration of how seemingly complex tasks can be broken down into a series of manageable steps. And that brings us to the two main types of chaining,
Okay.
forward chaining and backward chaining.
So with forward chaining, you start with the first step and gradually add more links to the chain.
So for instance, if we were teaching a child to wash their hands,
Okay.
we might start with just having them turn on the water, then reinforce that step. Once they've mastered that, we add the next step, like getting soap and so on.
Got it. And then backward chaining, you start with the final step and work backwards.
That's right. So we could teach a child to make their bed by starting with the final step, like tucking in the blanket. Once they've mastered that, we move to the previous step, like smoothing out the sheets and so on. This approach emphasizes that early contact with that natural reinforcer.
Right.
In this case, the feeling of having a made bed.
Right. So both methods have their pros and cons.
Yeah.
And the best choice really depends on the individual and the specific skill we're teaching. But there are potential challenges with chaining, especially with longer chains.
Yeah.
The source material mentions an air conditioning technician skipping a leak inspection because the system seems fine.
Oh, no.
While that might work in the short term, it reinforces a faulty chain and could lead to problems later on.
Absolutely. That's a great example of how omitting steps can lead to undesirable chains.
Right.
Especially in areas like safety and quality control. Consistency is vital. We need to monitor those chains carefully and ensure all the steps are performed correctly and consistently reinforced.
Otherwise, those hard-earned skills can just deteriorate over time.
Exactly.
It's like building a tower with blocks. If even one block is missing or out of place, the whole structure becomes unstable.
It does.
So monitoring and reinforcement are so crucial for maintaining the integrity of those behavioral chains.
Absolutely. And speaking of achieving those desired levels of performance,
Okay.
let's shift our focus to goal setting.
Goal setting.
This is another critical tool in our APA arsenal, but it's often misunderstood.
Yeah, it can be a very powerful tool for behavior change, but it's not as simple as just writing down a goal and hoping for the best.
You're right. It's more than just wishful thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I've certainly been guilty of setting goals that I never actually achieved.
All right.
Maybe I didn't have a solid plan or didn't celebrate those milestones along the way.
Right.
What makes the difference between a goal that motivates us and one that ends up abandoned in a notebook somewhere?
Well, the key is understanding that goals need to be paired with reinforcement to be effective.
Okay.
Goals themselves act as antecedents for performance.
Okay.
They set the stage, but they don't guarantee the outcome.
Right. So it's like setting out on a road trip with a destination in mind, but no map or supplies.
Exactly.
You might have a goal, but without those supports,
Yes.
it's going to be a lot harder to stay on track and reach your destination.
Exactly. And that's where reinforcement comes in. When we consistently pair reaching a goal with positive reinforcement, praise, tangible rewards, or even just that sense of accomplishment, the goal itself starts to become a secondary reinforcer.
Okay, so the goal itself becomes associated with that positive feeling,
Yes.
which then motivates us to keep striving towards future goals.
Right. It becomes less about the external reward and more about the intrinsic satisfaction of achieving something we set out to do.
I love that.
Precisely. And that's the beauty of properly set goals.
Yeah.
They can transform from mere targets into these motivating forces that drive performance and create a sense of accomplishment. But to be effective, goals need to possess certain qualities.
Absolutely. So it's not just about any goal. It's about setting goals that have the right balance of challenge and attainability.
You've hit the nail on the head
Right.
when it comes to setting effective goals.
Yes. And we talked about how important it is to avoid setting the bar too high as that can lead to those feelings of frustration and learned helplessness.
Exactly. It's crucial to set goals that are motivating yet realistic. Like, imagine expecting a client who's just learning to hold a crayon to suddenly start drawing intricate pictures.
Yeah, that would be setting them up for failure and discouragement rather than success.
Right, and that's why it's often better to adjust goals downward if they prove to be too ambitious. Starting smaller and building momentum can lead to faster progress in the long run.
Yeah, it's almost like those video games where you start with easier levels to learn the controls and gain confidence before facing tougher challenges.
That's a great analogy. Those early wins, no matter how small, help build that positive reinforcement cycle, which is essential for maintaining motivation.
Absolutely. One of the sources mentioned this intriguing concept of setting goals based on a 1% failure rate.
That's a fascinating approach. It really shifts our perspective towards attainability. Instead of pushing for the highest possible goal, we aim for something that's almost guaranteed to be successful.
So let's say we're teaching a client to identify different colors. Instead of expecting them to master all the colors at once, we might focus on just 2 colors initially, with a 99% success rate as our goal.
Exactly this way, the client experiences consistent reinforcement, which strengthens the behavior and accelerates their progress.
Yeah, it's like laying a strong foundation brick by brick, ensuring each one is securely in place before adding the next.
And this idea of shaping with sub-goals using those smaller, achievable steps can be applied on a larger scale too, like with organizational goals in a workplace setting.
Well, interesting. So instead of setting one massive, potentially overwhelming goal for an entire company, you break it down into smaller department-level goals.
Precisely. Each department focuses on achieving its own sub-goal, and as they reach those milestones, they contribute to the overall success of the organization.
I love that. It's like that saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Exactly. Large-scale behavior change, whether it's individual or organizational, is best achieved through those incremental steps.
And this all ties back to what we discussed earlier about Kaizen and that philosophy of continuous improvement.
Absolutely. It's about those small, consistent wins that, over time, lead to significant progress.
So, okay, we've covered the importance of setting those challenging yet attainable goals. But how do we actually determine what those goals should be? Where do we start?
That's where those 5 key sources of information we touched upon earlier come into play. Remember those.
Yes, we need to consider the characteristics of the performer's past history, the performance of others' existing standards, and the input of the performer themselves.
You got it. Let's break those down a bit further. First, we have the characteristics of the performance. Different tasks have different learning curves. Some skills are acquired quickly, while others require a more gradual progression.
So a goal that's appropriate for a task with a steep learning curve might be completely different from a goal for a task that involves a slower learning process.
Exactly. A great example is learning to ride a bike initially. There's a lot of wobbling and uncertainty, but once you find your balance, the skill progresses more rapidly.
Versus like learning a new language.
Right.
Might involve more gradual and consistent learning curve.
Precisely. Understanding these different learning curves helps us set appropriate goals and expectations.
And what about the performer's past history? How does that factor into goal setting?
That's an essential consideration. Someone who's experienced with a particular task or has a history of success in similar areas might be ready for a more challenging goal compared to someone who's brand new to it.
So it's like recognizing that everyone comes to the table with different strengths, weaknesses, and experiences.
Yeah. Exactly. We need to tailor our goals to the individual, taking into account their unique skill set and learning history.
Now, the next source you mentioned was the performance of others. Is that always a helpful strategy? I can see how comparing someone to their peers could be motivating for some, but potentially discouraging for others.
That's a great point. It's a delicate balance. We want to use the performance of others as inspiration and a source of information, but we need to be careful not to create unhealthy competition or set unrealistic expectations.
Right. It's like those situations where parents compare their child's academic performance to their siblings or classmates. It can backfire and lead to feelings of inadequacy.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where we use the achievements of others as motivation while still fostering a sense of individual progress and accomplishment.
Okay, and what about existing standards like those industrial engineered standards you mentioned earlier? Are those always a good guide for setting goals?
They can be a useful reference point, but it's important to remember that standards are often based on average performance, which might not be aspirational enough for every individual.
So we might need to adjust those standards upward to create goals that are truly challenging and motivating, especially for individuals who are exceeding expectations.
Exactly. And finally, we have the input of the performer themselves. Involving individuals in the goal-setting process can be incredibly empowering, especially for our clients.
It gives them a sense of ownership and control over their own progress, which is so crucial for fostering intrinsic motivation.
Absolutely. But again, we need to be mindful of the performer's knowledge and experience. If they're not familiar with the task or haven't had much success in similar areas, they might set goals that are either too ambitious or not challenging enough.
So it's about finding that balance between guidance and autonomy, ensuring that the individual feels empowered and supported in the process.
Exactly. It's about collaboration and shared decision-making. We want our clients to feel like active participants in their own journey of growth and development.
This has been such a rich discussion about goal setting.
Yeah.
It's clear that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach,
Yeah.
and that careful consideration and individualization are key.
Absolutely. And now with a deeper understanding of goal setting in our toolkit, let's transition to looking at some real-world applications of shaping chaining and goal setting in ABA practice.
Sounds great. I'm eager to hear about how these concepts come to life in real-world scenarios. What are some specific examples of how these techniques can be applied in those everyday scenarios we encounter as professionals?
Well, one area where shaping really shines is in developing communication skills, particularly with individuals on the autism spectrum who might be nonverbal or have limited verbal abilities.
Right, and we often work with clients who, might communicate differently,
Right.
and it's our job to find ways to help them express themselves effectively.
Exactly. And shaping can be incredibly powerful in those situations.
Okay.
We might start by reinforcing any attempt at communication, eye contact gestures, vocalizations, whatever it might be.
So even if it's not a perfect word or phrase, we acknowledge and reinforce that effort
Yes.
to encourage further communication attempts.
And as those attempts become more frequent and consistent, we can gradually increase the complexity of the communication we reinforce, shaping those initial sounds into words, then phrases, and eventually sentences.
Like building a bridge.
Yeah.
Starting with those initial supports.
Right.
And gradually removing them as the structure becomes stronger and more independent.
What a fantastic analogy. And speaking of bridges, chaining can be incredibly helpful in teaching those adaptive living skills that are essential for independence. So dressing, toileting, grooming, all those everyday tasks we might take for granted.
Right, and those tasks often involve a sequence of steps,
Yes.
which can be really overwhelming for some individuals.
Exactly. That's where chaining comes in. Instead of expecting someone to master the entire process of, say, getting dressed all at once, we can break it down into smaller, more manageable links in a behavioral chain.
Right, so instead of prompting them through each step, like put on your shirt, now button it, now zip up your pants,
Yeah.
we teach them to complete the entire chain independently.
That's the goal. And it can be applied to so many different areas: academics, social skills, vocational skills, any area where a complex task can be broken down into a sequence of behaviors.
Absolutely. Now shifting gears to goal setting.
Okay.
What are some of the challenges we might encounter as ABA professionals when trying to implement effective goal-setting procedures?
I think one common challenge is ensuring that the goals we set are truly individualized and meaningful for the client.
Right.
It's not about imposing our own ideas of what they should be achieving,
Right.
but about understanding their unique needs, preferences, and aspirations.
It needs to be driven by the client's individual journey.
Absolutely. And that often means involving the client in the goal-setting process as much as possible,
Right.
which can be tricky, especially if the client have limited communication skills.
But there are ways to make it more collaborative, like visual aids, choice boards, even involving family members or caregivers who know the client well. It's about finding creative ways to ensure their voice is heard.
Precisely. We need to be flexible and adaptable, finding ways to make the process accessible and engaging for each individual.
Another challenge I think we often face is ensuring that our goals are data-driven.
Oh, that's crucial.
Right.
We can't just be setting goals based on our intuition or what we think might be beneficial. We need objective data to guide our decisions.
We need to collect data, consistently analyze trends,
Yes.
and use that information to determine if our goals are appropriate,
Right.
if they're being met, and if we need to make adjustments.
Data-driven decision-making is the backbone of ABA,
It is.
and goal setting is no exception.
No.
We need that data to track progress,
Right.
identify areas where we need to intensify our efforts,
Yes.
and celebrate those successes along the way.
So we've talked about some of the challenges.
Yeah.
What are some practical tips for ensuring that we're implementing shaping, chaining, and goal setting effectively in our ABA practice? What advice would you give to our listeners who are eager to put these concepts into action?
First and foremost, start small.
Okay.
Don't try to tackle too much at once.
Okay.
Focus on 1 or 2 goals at a time, master those, and then move on to others. It's about building momentum and creating those early wins that fuel motivation.
It's like learning a new instrument.
Yes.
You don't start by trying to play a complex concerto.
Right.
You start with those basic scales and chords, mastering those fundamentals before moving on to more challenging pieces.
A perfect analogy, and never underestimate the power of reinforcement.
Oh, yeah.
Celebrate those small successes, a high five, a word of praise, even a small, tangible reward. Those reinforcements make a huge difference in maintaining motivation and shaping those desired behaviors.
I agree. And don't be afraid to adjust those goals along the way.
Yes.
If a goal is too challenging, break it down into smaller steps.
Yeah.
If it's too easy, raise the bar a bit. It's about finding that sweet spot where the challenge is just right.
Yes.
Motivating, but not overwhelming.
Flexibility is key.
Absolutely.
And finally, remember that collaboration is essential.
Yes.
We need to be working closely with the client, their families, and other professionals involved in their care.
Yeah.
It's a team effort.
It's about creating a supportive network where everyone is working together towards those shared goals.
Yes.
Celebrating those successes together.
Yes.
And problem solving those challenges that inevitably arise.
Shaping, chaining, and goal setting, they're not solo endeavors.
Right.
They're most effective when we embrace that spirit of collaboration and shared commitment to the client's well-being.
Well said. This has been such an insightful and enriching deep dive into these foundational ABA concepts.
Yes.
I feel like we've not only gained a deeper understanding of shaping, chaining, and goal setting, but we've also explored how to apply these techniques in a thoughtful, ethical, and client-centered way.
I completely agree. It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you and our listeners.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. We hope you found this deep dive valuable and are inspired to continue exploring the fascinating world of ABA. Remember, keep learning, keep growing, and keep making a positive difference in the lives of those you serve. Until next time, this has been ABA Chapter Chat.